Hello and welcome to the second of my 3 videos on Napoleonic tactics using Tricolor. We're going to talk about cavalry today, and if you remember, and hopefully you did watch the infantry video I made, towards the end I showed why infantry form square and what happens when they're attacked by a couple of different types of cavalry. I'd like to, just before we start, read you a passage here from a book I was reading on the Battle of Waterloo, and it has a couple of very interesting attacks in it, and I'll read this out. Merlin's Netherland Cavalry Brigade to support the Brunswick Hussars and Lancers, and led the whole formation towards the French. Confronted by a brigade of French cavalry, the Netherland Cavalry fled in disorder before contact had been made. The outnumbered Brunswickers being forced to retire with them. So that's point 1 I want to discuss when I finish this article. Wellington himself tried to rally the cavalry just south of Quatre Bras, but was almost surrounded by French and only escaped by leaping his horse over the 92nd Highlanders. Point 2. Deployed in line, the Highlanders were, who drove the French cavalry back. 2 British battalions, the 42nd Highlanders and the 44th Foot, the 44th Foot is what I meant to say, were caught before they could form a square. The universal defence against cavalry. Tick on that one. The 42nd closed their square with a large number of French cavalry inside and killed them all. Point 3. The 44th made no attempt to form a square, their rear rank turning around and the battalion fighting back to back decimated the attacking French. Point 4. Now that little article there has 4 points in it that I've read this several times that leave me gobsmacked. The first one being, I don't know why I'm gobsmacked with this, but the Netherland cavalry turned and fled when the French cavalry moved towards them. Now that happened in real life. Those cavalry, confronted by the French, their morale broke before they even made contact. Of course, we're playing with inanimate objects, giving them values and movement. Those Netherland cavalry, if you wanted them to attack those French, would. There'd be no routing before contact was made. They might not survive the contact, but they would go and engage. So that, of course, is one of the differences between real life and wargaming with miniatures. The second point was Wellington was almost caught and only escaped by leaping his horse over the 92nd Highlanders. And I actually wonder what that means. You've got this Highlander standing there with this big bonnet on his head and a horse racing towards him leaps over the top. Now, I know there was some good horsemanship in those days. I wonder if that's what they really mean, or the Highlanders would have parted to let him through, or the rear rank would have parted and he would have jumped over the front rank who might have been kneeling. It's really hard to say. I just can't imagine him leaping a horse that high over some troops standing shoulder to shoulder and everything working out for the best for everyone. But that's what it says. The second part was where the square closed with several French cavalry inside. It says a large number. Now, I mean, French cavalry did everything they could to get inside a square so they could hack it to pieces from the inside out. And this didn't work for them. All of them were killed. So I wonder what a large number actually is and what the heck they were doing that they weren't decimating or breaking that square open. I think a lot of this actually has to do with the fact that they were British troops, and they were better, British troops, regular army, better trained, equipped, morale, and whatnot else. They didn't seem to fall apart quite as easily under adverse conditions, and I think any other nation with that scenario might have been in a lot more trouble than this British one turned out. And the last but not least was this battalion that didn't form square, the rear rank about faced, and with their volleys, they decimated the attacking French. If it was that easy, why would squares have ever been used in the first place? I can only think that what it's not saying there is perhaps the volume of fire coming from the whole battalion, and the number of cavalry attacking. They might have bowled enough of them out of the saddles to convince the rest to leave that melee alone. But it's an interesting article, it truly is. Alrighty, let's move on. Let's look at the different types of cavalry that you'll get to play with in Napoleonics. I'll get my pencil pointer. Over here on the far left, my left, are the light cavalry, hussars, lancers, dragoons, cuirassiers, guard cavalry. Light cavalry, light horses, fast, nimble, used for reconnaissance and skirmishing, but could form up and be used as a strike force in a battle. Hussars, little bit basically the same as lights, but their morale, their corps esprit is just a little bit better. The uniforms are fancier. They believe they were better, and so they are, but just a little bit better. Dragoons. Oops, we'll move the lancers out of the equation for the moment. Dragoons, all-round cavalry in any army. You might call it the workhorse of the army. They were originally mounted infantry, meant to get off their horse and fight as infantry once they reached a point that they were to defend. But as time went on, they were used more and more as a form of heavy cavalry, even though they carried a great big musket with them. In fact, we actually have rules in Tricolor where you can dismount your dragoons and fight them as infantry. Every fourth one holds 4 horses, so you lose a quarter to keep the horses under control, but the rest can fight as infantry. I've never done it, and I would never intend to do it. They're way more valuable to me as cavalry than they are as infantry. Next, cuirassiers, French cuirassiers, the primary strike force of any country who has them. They're the leftover of the mounted knights from old. That's the cuirass, the big steel helmet, big heavy troopers on big horses. And that cuirass is enough to deflect a musket ball at anything but virtually point-blank range. And of course, in a melee, it is good protection for the rider against sword strikes. So they are a wonderful body of cavalry to own and a nasty body of cavalry to be up against. Next are your guard cavalry. They're British Life Guards out there. The French had grenadiers, a cheval, and every nation had its guard cavalry. Why are guard cavalry better than cuirassiers? It's all to do with their training, their equipping, and their experience in battle, and their corps esprit. Right, so that's just talking about the units. What I'd like to do now, lancers. Did I mention lancers? Great for attacking square with the reach of the lance. In a cavalry melee, they strike the opposition cavalry and they have the reach of the lance, which gives them the initial advantage. But once they then are mixed in a melee, and it's all twisting, turning, slashing and carrying on, the lance becomes a hindrance. And I'll get back to that when we come to their fighting value in points. It's reflected in the rules. Alrighty, movement across the battlefield. Light cavalry and hussars move at 15 inches in tricolour per move, or 18 in open order. And 18 in open order simply means that they choose to actually break out of formation and ride in a loose formation across the battlefield, which allows them to go around small obstacles, etc., and move a little bit faster. Only disadvantage with that, and it's not much of one, is when they get to where they're going, they have to reform into their column or line if they want to get the maximum melee value that they can have. But that only takes a half a move for them to reform, so very usable cavalry. The other thing they can do is, see that Stonehenge, see that fence? They can move across a battlefield as though they're not there. They can actually jump them, and that's taller than a man, by the way, too. So I know you're immediately thinking, Wellington could jump that, and he could. It's whether he could jump a man with a high, tall bonnet on his head I'm wondering about. Imagine the reach and the manoeuvrability these cavalry have on the battlefield. They can go just about anywhere and harass anyone, but because they are light, their value isn't as high as heavy cavalry, but very useful. The rest of these cavalry are impeded by those sorts of terrain structures. Not terrain structures, they're man-made structures. And as a result, when you're using heavy cavalry, you're looking for open terrain that they can get into, spread out into line, and charge across unimpeded at the enemy. And of course, if you're there, chances are the enemy has to be there to stop you, and so you'll get your charge in across good terrain. Rightio. Now let's move on to the lancers. They go 15 inches a move, the same as light cavalry. Okay, so but they can't go into open order. They can't get that advantage, but they do move faster than heavy, same speed as lights. So they're pretty good too, except they can't get across these fences and walls, etc. We move on to Dragoons, Couriers, and Guard. All of those are moving at 12 inches a move. So it might only be, you might think, well, they're only 3 inches slower than the lights, but if you have to move several feet across a battlefield, they're going to arrive a long time after the lights have. Alrighty, now that's their movement. All of them get 1 charge bonus of 6 inches. If any of those units can reach an enemy within a charge bonus, which is an extra 6 inches, so that would be 18 inches for the heavies, 12 plus 6, and 21 for the lights, 15 plus 6. You don't charge in open order, so we're not going to worry about the 18 plus 6. And for the lancers, of course, 21 inches. If you can reach the enemy within that, you can have the charge bonus. If you can't, you can't claim the charge bonus. It's a once up, because you can't charge all around the battlefield. The horses get blown and are worn out. So you get that. If only if you can reach the enemy. Okay, so that's movement, and really that's about all there is for movement. Let's move on now to talk about their morale. Lights have regular morale. What that simply means is that when they take casualties up to roughly half their number, they may very well not go forward into battle anymore. I said about hussars thinking themselves a little bit better than lights. Their morale in Tricolor is that of elites, and elites will stay till they're down to a quarter of their number. So that's one of the really the only advantage that hussars have over lights, is they'll stay in the fight longer. Lancers are generally regular troops, the same as lights. At around about 50% casualties, they will move on. Having said that, every army had their guard version of these forces, but we're talking today predominantly about the bulk of this type of cavalry. Dragoons were elites, so they'll stay in the fight till about a quarter of their number, and that's quite a small number to get down to. But this is what the rules say in Tricolor, and the guy, I believe, has done his homework and he's come up with these sorts of figures, so it applies to everyone, therefore it's fair. Couriers, these heavy cavalry, are guard, and they'll stay till an eighth of their number are left. So they are excellent troops to have and fight with, and for the opposition they're a real annoyance because they seem to always be around. Guard, of course, are guard as well, and they'll stay till an eighth of their number. Rightio. So the morale, you can see, is important because after a melee or being shot at by cannon and infantry, provided your morale hasn't broken, you've still got units on the battlefield. As long as you've got that, they are an annoyance to your enemy's infantry and or cavalry and or cannons. Let's talk about what they're worth in the fight now. Lights are worth 3 points a man in a charge. You always get an extra point for charging because you hit with that momentum. So whatever I tell you they are in a charge, take 1 point off for their normal value. So if they're hit in the flank, or if they're not moving when they're attacked, they're at 1 point less than what I'm going to tell you. But you'd be crazy to be caught like that, so we'll talk about their charge values. So lights, 3 points a man. Hussars, 3 points a man. Dragoons, 4 points a man. Lancers, 3 points a man. Couriers, 5. And guard cavalry, 6 points a man in a charge. So what's this tell you about how you should use your cavalry? Well, if you've got lights, a light infantryman worth 3 points a man, it'd be wonderful to attack him with a guard unit and actually have him commit to the engagement. I don't think the lights would ever hang around, because they're so fast and nimble, to be hit like that by guard cavalry. But we're talking about equal numbers here. If the guards had been reduced through whatever sort of casualty rates to a small number, and you had a whole regiment, fresh regiment of, say, lights, for instance, it may well be that it's worth attacking the guards to wipe them out. But let's say on an equal basis, guard cavalry at 6 points a man and lights at 3 points a man, that's obviously a 2-to-1 ratio, and that's how Tricolor work their melees out. At a 2-to-1 ratio, there's always a possibility that the higher one, in this case the guards, could lose. And we've read that article about how those Netherland cavalry didn't even come into contact before they turned and fled. So stranger things can happen. But at 2-to-1, the guard, we'll say the guard in this case, 5 times out of 6, they're going to beat the light troops in that scenario. Couriers are worth 5 points a man. Again, up against lights, provided it's more than 1.5 to 1, it'll go up to 2. So at 3 points, if we add half of 3, which is 1.5 on, that's 4.5. A Courier is still worth 5. That's more. It's not. So that is 2-to-1 as well. And again, the Couriers will generally always beat the lights 5 times out of 6. The Lancers, however, are valued at only 3 points a man. And I believe that's from what I was saying earlier about the lance being great for the initial strike, but a cumbrance once the actual melee takes place. So Lancers are only worth 3 points a man. They would fight on equal ground with Hussars and Lights and Dragoons, because Dragoons are worth 4 points a man. Now, as I said before, you take the ratios: Hussar, Lights or Lancers, 3 points a man. What's half of 3? 1.5, 4.5 points. Dragoons are worth 4 points. It's less than 2-to-1, so they would fight on equal terms as well. So in all of this cavalry, from here down, equal units would stand a 50-50 chance of winning a melee. And in the game, in World or on the tabletop, that's fair. I mean, you can't say who's going to win for whatever reason on the day. It could be any number of factors. These are inanimate objects. So it's a 50-50 chance if it's less than 2-to-1. And even on 2-to-1, you could still lose 1 time out of 6. Above 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, you're always going to win. With those higher ratios, it's just a matter of how many casualties you'll lose before you annihilate the other unit. Okay, so we've talked about movement, the value of the units, their morale. Just like to basically finish up by saying rule of thumb tactics when using cavalry. Don't attack infantry directly, because their musket fire can be detrimental, and if it kills enough of you, you will fail the attack. And there's even that example I read you out earlier of where that actually happened. Always try to get round the flank of infantry, and that's where you'll do your best work. And the examples of that were in my video on infantry tactics, where I had 16 Hussars attacking a Nassau line, and the fact that they rode over the top of it no matter what it tried to do. The next, okay, so always put heavy cavalry against lighter cavalry if you can, for the obvious reasons. You've got more of a chance of winning the melee, and because these cavalry are expensive to buy, and of course you pay a lot more for a guards cavalry person than you do a lights, and I won't get into the purchasing power of that because it's something totally different again. Because you're purchasing not only the value of the morale, the experience, the fact that it's a heavy cavalry, historically worth quite a bit, etc., etc. There's a lot goes into working out the purchasing power. It's an interesting thing. We might do it another day. So, always try heavy cavalry against light cavalry, and if you are opposed by the enemy's heavy cavalry, use your light cavalry, and if it's one-to-one fight, just hope that it'll turn out in your favour, because if you can destroy his heavy cavalry and yours is still on the field, then you've got a huge advantage in the battle. Always try for the flank on everything, infantry, cavalry and guns, and horse guns. Now, if you watch my battle on Bremer Ridge, you'll see that there were 2 horse guns out in front of the heavy cavalry, picking away at the Austrian Couriers, and they lowered the number of Austrian Couriers to a point that when they were hit by the French Carbineers, which are just an upgraded form of Couriers, they went straight over the top of them in probably, I think it was a 2-to-1 melee, and they won it, of course. Well, you'd expect that. So horse guns can reduce the odds in your favour if they're out there and they get enough shots at the enemy. Because remember here, firing at cavalry, it's all in formation. It's not like light troops. Even light cavalry isn't spread out that far to reduce the casualties. If the ball is fired from the side, it can go through and take out 4 horses. If it's fired down a column, it could take out as many as the momentum of the cannonball has, and that depends on the gun firing it. Horse guns are as quick as cavalry, even light cavalry, so they can easily go with them, and although they only fire a small shot, because the cavalry are generally condensed up, unless they're in line, in which case they might take out less, perhaps 2 instead of a column, which might be 3 or 4 deep. So horse guns are a huge add-on to cavalry, and they're expensive, but not as expensive as the heavy guns, etc. And it's worthwhile, if you can, to always have 1 or 2 of those if you can afford them. Going with your cavalry, it gives them a huge advantage. And even if your cavalry lose the melee, the horse guns can generally pack up and run away faster than the enemy can get to them. Really, that's it. My next video will be on Napoleonic tactics for artillery, and we might do something a bit interesting with that and have a couple of examples of how artillery take out casualties. Alrighty, so thanks for watching this. Hope you enjoy it, and watch the one on artillery next. Thanks, bye.